Part 55. Junhua was forced into a substitute marriage as a male concubine. People are unlucky, and they really stuff their teeth when they drink cold water. As soon as Junhua got rid of the person who wanted to kill him, he picked up a piece of warm clothes and was inexplicably tied to a sedan chair as a newcomer. Do you want to be so unlucky in life? I'm really not your fifth young master, I just passed by and picked up the warm clothes. If Junhua knew that picking up a piece of clothing would cause him so much trouble, he would rather freeze to death on the side of the road than wear that bright red wedding dress. The two maids on the side ignored his words, and after serving dinner, they bent down and left the room. Junhua took 2 deep breaths, and after he had some strength in his body, he slowly moved to the table, looking at the food on the plate. He was so hungry that he didn't care if the food was poisonous, so he picked up the chopsticks and ate it. After he was full of food and drink, the imaginary strength did not come back. But there was a feeling of soreness and weakness all over his body. Actually drugged? So, they know that I'm not the 5th young master of the Shen family? Junhua really has the heart to vomit blood. What kind of blood mold did he pour during this time to encounter such a bad thing? His eyelids grew heavier and heavier, and he finally fell asleep on the table. The 2 maids outside the door saw that there was no movement in the room for a long time. They opened the door, walked to Junhua's side, and looked down at Junhua, who had fainted at the dining table. Is that really okay? One of the well-behaved girls looked uneasy. She was really scared, afraid that things would be exposed and that she would be killed. What else would you do? Do you want to send an empty sedan chair to the Wanu palace? The other maid was pretty, and her smart eyes were shrewd. She knew that if she really sent an empty sedan chair to the Wanu palace, it would not only be their family sending team that would die, but even the Shen family would not be able to escape the disaster of extermination. Therefore, when the family sending team caught Junhua by mistake, she made a mistake and decided that Junhua was the 5th young master of the Shen family who escaped from marriage. But the well-behaved maid was uneasy. She was afraid that the man in front of her would tell the truth to the regent on the day of the wedding, and they would still be unable to escape death. No, but the pretty maid looked stunned and said solemnly, Liuyan, from now on, he is our 5th young master. Liuyan took a deep look at Luju. Although she extremely disapproved of Luju's method in her heart, but now they can only be a dead horse doctor. If you can hide it from the regent, then everyone will be happy. If not, you can only accept your fate and obediently wait for death. She seemed to have made up her mind, nodded, and said with a serious face, Okay, from now on, he is the 5th young master of the Shen family. Junhua woke up in a swaying sedan chair, recalling that yesterday he was stunned by sweat medicine and couldn't breathe. He has never been so aggrieved when he has grown so big. Especially thinking that someone in the family sending team knew that he was not the 5th young master of the Shen family. But they still sent him to a sedan chair and forcibly married him without knowing whether the other party was a man or a woman. He was so angry that he wanted to vomit blood. He took a deep breath. Now he only had to wait for the effect of the sweat medicine in his body to slowly pass, and he could escape from this place. However, before the strength in his body could recover, the sedan chair suddenly stopped. Just when he was puzzled, Luju lifted the sedan curtain and said respectfully, 5th young master, the Wanu palace has arrived. Junhua raised his eyes and glanced at the so-called Wanu palace, but unexpectedly found that this palace covers an extremely wide area, with red walls and yellow tiles, highlighting the royal sense of wealth and solemnity. It's just that, when he looked at the side door, he had the heart to hit the wall. Marriage through the side door, isn't this a concubine? How can he say that he is also a prince? How can he be small? No, No. That's not the point. Shouldn't the point be that he takes a concubine? Also, who is the regent? Why haven't you heard of it? Fifth young master. Please get off the sedan chair. Luju always pays attention to Junhua's words and deeds, and is afraid that Junhua will run away. Junhua looked at Luju in front of him coldly. He said that it was impossible to be a concubine for others. Fifth young master, please don't embarrass the slave. Luju looked pitiful. If she was unaware, she would think that Junhua had bullied her. He was accepted as a small concubine. Junhua would never agree. How could he say that he was also the Prince Junhua of the Holy Dynasty, if he went to be a small concubine? Where would the face of the Holy Dynasty go? He leaned against the door of the sedan car and said, "Girl, do you want to be rich and expensive?" Luju rolled her eyes and replied, "I don't want to. Also, please call the slave and the maid Luju." The answer was crisp. Junhua was a little speechless. He glanced at the surrounding send-off team that gradually relaxed his vigilance and felt that the strength in his body gradually recovered. He finally stopped being patient, jumped off the sedan chair, and quickly ran forward. Luju was stunned for a moment, and when she saw Junhua fleeing, she shouted, "Catch him, don't let him escape. Otherwise we will all die." There was no shortage of skilled guards in the send-off procession, and they rushed towards Junhua one after another. There are more and more people watching the excitement around. They look at the fleeing Junhua. They look confused. I don't know which one Junhua is singing. Seeing that Junhua rushed out of the encirclement and was about to regain his free body, suddenly, a pure black horse galloped over from the official road. Junhua looked at the black horse that was crashing towards him, and easily dodged with the wrong body. He was just about to continue running, when the man on horseback turned over and dismounted, grabbed Junhua, who wanted to escape, and hugged him into his arms. Being so light, Junhua's expression turned cold, and with a force in his hand, he slapped the man's chest with one palm. The man was already on guard. He reached out and grabbed the hand that wanted to sneak attack him, and with force on his hand, the wrist of Junhua, who was pinched, hurt as if his bones had been crushed by the other party. Junhua looked pained, and let out a painful snort between his nose. "If you want to die, this prince can fulfill you." A cold menace sounded in his ears. He believed that if he continued to resist, he would definitely be killed by the man with a gloomy look in front of him. He didn't want to die, so he quickly calmed down. Seeing that his masculinity was extraordinary, and his whole body exuded the aura of a king unique to the superior, he somewhat guessed that this person was the person the fifth young master of the Shen family was going to marry. The man didn't give Junhua a good face. He threw the quiet Junhua to the send-off team that caught up with him with a cold face, and said coldly, "Take care of your people. Don't lose the face of this prince." He threw the reins of his horse to the butler who greeted him, and walked towards the main entrance of the Wanu palace with a gloomy expression. Luju looked at the man with a gloomy expression. Her heart trembled, and she looked at Junhua, who was caught by the family sending team, and suddenly regretted her previous decision. If the regent knew that Junhua was not the fifth young master of the Shen family, they would definitely be unable to escape death. But now it's too late to regret it, so she can only bite the bullet. She hurried over, helped Junhua with tears in her eyes, and pleaded in a low voice, "This young master, can you please cooperate? If the regent knows that you are not the fifth young man of the Shen family, all of us will have to die." Regent. Junhua was stunned. He looked at the man's distant back, and finally knew who the other party was. Biming Qianiu, regent of the Ri Yao dynasty. In the festive house covered with red window grills, Junhua sat on the edge of the bed, thinking about how to deal with tonight's events. Squeak, the heavy door was pushed open from the outside. Junhua was so frightened that he sat on his lap and looked at the visitor coldly with a pair of cold eyes. If the other party dares to touch him, he will definitely fight with the other party. Baiming Qianyu slowly walked in front of Junhua, looked down at Junhua condescendingly, and said in an indifferent tone, "It's all an exchange of interests. So don't expect this prince to sleep with you." Hey! Junhua's eyes lit up. This feeling is good. From now on, you will be in peace in this prince's palace. And this prince will keep you safe all your life. If you dare to betray this prince will definitely make your life worse than death. Baiming Qianyu's expression was cold. Without a trace of emotion. Junhua bowed his head, indicating that he knew. As for the safety point, he is sure that he will be safe, but he can't guarantee how long this safety point will last. After all, if he finds a chance to escape, he will definitely flee back to the Holy Dynasty without stopping, and he will never see him again. Baiming Qianyu saw that Junhua was so cooperative. He was a little satisfied. He saw Luju bring 2 cups of wine. His expression eased a lot. He lifted the wine handed by Luju and was about to hand it to Junhua, who knew that Luju moved faster than him, and handed another cup of wine to Junhua. It is difficult for Junhua to ride a tiger now, so he took the wine handed by Luju. It's okay, no one knows that he is Prince Junhua. When this prince escapes back to the Holy Dynasty, he will forget about this bad thing. Junhua comforted himself so much, he crossed his arms with the wine and Baiming Qianyu, and drank a glass of wine. Luju saw Junhua drink the wine, and her heart was relieved. Then she respectfully carried the tray out of the new house, leaving the 2 of them alone. Baiming Qianyu didn't have much affection for Junhua. He picked up the quilt from the bed and put it on the ground, and said ruthlessly, "You sleep on the ground tonight. After tonight, this prince will not come to your courtyard again." Junhua, who was driven to sleep on the ground, was not unhappy at all. He calmly picked up the quilt on the ground, went around to the other side of the screen, and spread the quilt on the ground. Baiming Qianyu was quite satisfied when he saw that Junhua was so self-aware. He lay down with his clothes closed, and he didn't know when he would fall asleep. He felt that he hadn't slept for long, and was woken up by a slight sound beside him. He opened his eyes, a cold light shot out of his eyes, and looked coldly at Junhua, who climbed into his bed. "What are you going to do?" His voice was cold, and he coldly questioned Junhua, who looked a little weird. Junhua was hot all over his body at this time, as if there was a fire burning in all corners of his body, as if he was going to burn him from the inside out. He gasped and said in an angry tone, "Why are you so shameless as to actually drug me?" If it weren't for the fact that he was now hot and unbearably hot and weak, and his limbs were sore, he would definitely strangle Baiming Qianyu to death. Drugged? Through the flickering candlelight, Baiming Qianyu found that Junhua's face was abnormally red, and the temperature of his body was also terrifying, and the heavy breath sprayed on his cheeks. At this glance, it is obvious that the other party has been drugged. At first, Junhua was able to control himself from thinking about that aspect with his willpower, but the heat in his body gradually devoured his remaining willpower. He leaned down and kissed him towards Baiming Qianyu. Baiming Qianyu has never touched a man, and he is also very resistant to male concubines in his heart. If he didn't want to stabilize the Bai family, he would not have been able to accept Shen Li as a male concubine. He looked at the lips that came up from the kiss, and subconsciously wanted to push the other party away, but Junhua had a lot of strength and kissed him directly. When the lips touched together, the imagined disgust was not there, but a faint smell lingered on the tip of the nose. In particular, the other party's kissing skills are very good, and it easily arouses the desire in his body. He turned over and pressed Junhua under him. His dark and deep eyes were dyed with the color of desire, and he tore apart Junhua's shirt with brute force. The sky was slightly bright, and there was a knock on the door from outside, and a soft voice came from outside the door. Prince, I shouldn't have bothered you today, but something big happened. Please go and preside over the overall situation. Baiming Qianyu, who had just closed his eyes, opened his eyes helplessly. He got out of bed gently, put on his clothes and was about to leave. But as soon as he took a step, he paused, looked back at Junhua who was sleeping deeply, and a warm smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. Junhua was woken up by Luju. He opened his eyes. A cold star shot out of his eyes, staring coldly at Luju, as if he wanted to stare into her flesh. Luju chuckled in her heart, and was stared at by Junhua coldly. She hurriedly took a step back and kept a safe distance from Junhua. You drugged it? It's obviously a question sentence, but Junhua is very sure. He had thought about it just now. It was impossible for Baiming Qianyu to drug him, and the only thing that wanted to drug him was to keep this Luju. The slave also wants to help the young master. She was not halfway through her words, but was interrupted by Junhua in a cold voice. Help me? That's right, young master, you don't know. You are married to the regent. The regent is powerful and rich. From now on you can enjoy all the glory and wealth. And you will never have to live the embarrassing days of picking up other people's clothes to wear. Luju has an expression of, I'm thinking about you. It was really an accident to pick up clothes and wear them. If it weren't for the dark night and high wind, he stepped on the air and fell into the dark river in the mountain. He would not have come to the Riyao dynasty from Jinghe kingdom. Finally picked up a life from the dark river. Who knew that out of the dark river only to find that the conditions outside were more severe than the dark river. Only to see that the snow outside was white, the sky was cold, and he was shivering with cold. Just when he thought he was going to freeze to death, he happened to see the red clothes that had been dropped on the side of the road, and he couldn't stand the cold and put on that suit without thinking about it. Who knew that it was this suit of clothes that caused him to face such an embarrassing situation? Knock tilde knock tilde, the door was knocked on from the outside. Junhua was not entangled in this matter. After all, the matter had already happened, and no matter how much he said, it would be useless. The most important thing now was to escape from the Wanu palace first. And then he could return to the Holy Dynasty. He looked at Luju, who had been waiting beside him, and said indifferently, You go out first. Slave maid change the young master's clothes. Seeing that Junhua did not pursue her drugging, Luju was relieved and said attentively, Get out. Junhua did not have a trace of warmth in his voice. Okay. Seeing Junhua's gloomy face, Luju didn't dare to anger Junhua, so she hurriedly bent down and retreated. When there was no one in the room, Junhua struggled to sit up. He endured the soreness and powerlessness on his body, and got out of bed to dress. Baiming Qianyu. It's really cheap for you. The more Junhua thought about it, the more angry he became, thinking that Prince Junhua of his dignified Holy Dynasty was actually committed to Baiming Qianyu. If this was passed back, where would his old face go? Now he just wants to escape from the Wanu palace, and never set foot in the land of the Riyao dynasty again. Young master. Are you dressed? Luju's voice came, faintly with a hint of urging. Junhua was angry in his heart and did not talk. Young master? There was a hint of urgency in the voice of Luju outside the door. Junhua slowly came to the door, opened the door, and saw several maids standing outside the door. And they hurriedly saluted when they saw Junhua. Junhua ignored the strange maids, glanced at Luju and Liuyan waiting outside the door, saw that the two of them looked worried, and asked, Something? Luju was just about to reply, but the maid on the side hurriedly replied, "Young Master Shen, you should go to Tingshui courtyard now and say hello to Mrs. Jing." Junhua knows that it is impossible to do things according to his previous temperament now, although there are 100 unwillingness in his heart, but he does not go to ask for peace. "You're leading the way." Junhua is neither humble nor arrogant, so that several maids can't find trouble if they want to. "Young Master Shen, please." The maid at the head made a gesture of please, inviting Junhua to go ahead. Junhua is used to walking in the front at home, so he is not polite at all. He walks directly in the front. He exudes the unique kingly momentum of the superior, which makes several maids behind him secretly frightened. I really can't understand how a concubine can have such a strong momentum. Junhua dragged his sore body and walked for almost half an hour, exuding a thin layer of sweat all over his body, and his legs trembled weakly. Luju was very discerning, seeing that Junhua's steps were getting smaller and smaller. Knowing that Junhua was unwell, she stepped forward and asked the maid at the head, "Sister, where is Mrs. Jing's courtyard? Why didn't you see Mrs. Jing's courtyard for so long?" "What, sister? Does my sister think that our Mrs. Jing lives far away?" The maid at the head is called Shui Hu Del, who is pampered by Mrs. Jing on weekdays, except for a few guards around the regent. She dares to provoke, and she is not afraid of anyone else. Seeing that Luju dared to question her at this moment, her willow eyebrows were upside down, and her expression was gloomy, which made Luju quickly hang her head in fear. Junhua, who walked in front, has always had the behavior of protecting the short. He saw Luju speaking for him, but he was trained. And he said majestically, "Isn't it far away?" He is not stupid. How can he not know that this maid is deliberately tossing him around the road? For most of the hour, he could walk around the periphery of the Wanu palace. Shui Hu Del never expected that Junhua would dare to offend the prince's favorite Mrs. Jing in public, and admired him in her heart for not being afraid of death. How much the prince loves Mrs. Jing, as long as everyone in the Yao dynasty has heard of it. She didn't expect that the fifth young master of the Shen family would dare to offend Mrs. Jing for a little cheap maid on the first day he entered the door. With a look of good drama on her face, she wanted to see how long this person named Shen Li could live in the Wanu palace. Raising her eyes to see the sun in the sky, she didn't continue to detour, lowered her eyebrows and said, "I'm sorry, young master, my wife does live a little off, and I still look at my young master's broad mind." Fence sitter. What Junhua disdained the most was this kind of wall grass. And he responded indifferently, "Well, I know." His expression instantly angered Shui Hu Del, and she secretly scolded Junhua in her heart. What is it that is arrogant? Everyone knows that the regent doesn't like men, and if he marries, he will be left out in the cold. She snorted coldly in her heart, and politely guided Junhua to Tingshui courtyard. Tingshui courtyard is located directly south of the palace, close to the regent's Jing Yashuen, and from the distance between the two courtyards, you can see how much Biming Qianyu loves Mrs. Jing on weekdays. Walking into the Tingshui courtyard, a faint fragrance of flowers came to the nose. Junhua raised his eyes, only to see a few plum blossoms erected under the corner of the wall. And the plum blossoms on the branches were in full bloom, exuding bursts of fragrance. And a tall woman in a pale red palace skirt was already waiting in the courtyard. I saw that the woman lightly swept her eyebrows and eyes with spring. Her skin was fine and fair, her cherry mouth was red without dotting, delicate and beautiful. And the 2 strands of hair on her cheeks gently brushed her face with the wind, adding a bit of seductive style. "Brother, are you lost? The sun is already on the sun, and you came to say hello. And my sister is almost tired of waiting here." The woman's voice was nice, but there was a hint of provocation that made the listener a little harsh. Junhua didn't want to cause trouble. And with the mentality that more things are better than less, he replied with an apologetic face, "I'm sorry for keeping you waiting." Seeing Junhua's confession, Mrs. Jing's arrogance rose instantly. Her face was slightly cold, and she said, "Since my younger brother also knows that Mrs. Jing has been waiting for a long time, then my younger brother will be punished in the same place to stand, and I will come to ask Mrs. Jing for peace after an hour." She deliberately wanted to give Junhua a dismissal, so that Junhua knew that she was not easy to provoke, and he should not provoke her in the future. If he is obedient, she will let him live in peace and stability in the Wanu palace for the rest of his life. If he is not obedient, she will definitely kill him by any means. She turned around and wanted to go back to the room, but the Luju on the side couldn't stand it anymore, so she stepped forward and said politely, "Mrs. Jing, my young master has been weak and sick since he was a child. You let my young master stand in this ice and snow for an hour. I am afraid that my young master will not be able to bear it." She originally didn't want to come out, but last night, because she was drugged out of proportion, it seemed that she put too much, resulting in Junhua almost didn't sleep well last night, and today he got up and walked for more than half an hour. Looking at Junhua's uncomfortable trembling slightly, she felt guilty in her heart, so she stood up and spoke for Junhua. "Mouthy." Mrs. Jing looked at the Luju that came out. A trace of yin owl flashed in her eyes, and she said to Shui Hu Del, "Palm." "Whoa." Shui Hu Del replied respectfully, stepped forward, and slapped Luju in the face. When he landed, a 5-finger mark appeared on her white and tender cheeks, which was very dazzling. Tears flashed in Luju's eyes, but she clenched her teeth and stubbornly didn't say a word. Smack! Another slap slapped on Luju's other face, and the clear slap made Liuyan on the side tremble. And she didn't even dare to raise her head when she was timid, hanging her head in a hurry. Junhua frowned. He didn't want to be nosy, but how could Luju be beaten because of him, as a man? He couldn't stand by. He stepped forward, grabbed the hand that still wanted to hit Luju again, and warned mercilessly with a cold and ruthless look in his eyes, "She is my maid. And I will discipline her if she is wrong, and it will not be your turn yet." With that, he threw Shui Hu Del's wrist away. Shui Hu Del deliberately took a step back from the situation, and then fell to the ground, crying, "Wu tilde." Junhua was stunned, so he let go of Shui Hu Del's hand. Why did Shui Hu Del fall to the ground? Seeing this, Mrs. Jing immediately raised her eyebrows and scolded angrily, "Shen Li, you are actually bullying my person? Do you still have Mrs. Jing in your eyes?" It's the first time Junhua has been so speechless. He has never seen this battle, and he doesn't know how to deal with such a thing. Luju naturally knew that the other party was deliberate. But now she didn't dare to talk nonsense. After all, if she provoked Mrs. Jing, then she didn't know how to die. She hung her head very unrighteously and left the problem to Junhua to deal with. Mrs. Jing saw that Junhua was silent. She didn't give up, and just stepped forward to scold Junhua. But her eyes caught a glimpse of the blue-purple kiss mark exposed under Junhua's collar. The bruised purple kiss mark was like a sharp sword, mercilessly stabbing her eyes. She didn't expect that the prince, who didn't touch men, would actually touch Shen Li last night. Thinking of the prince's warmth to the man in front of her, jealousy made her good-looking face hideous. "Shen Li, you want to ride on the head of Mrs. Jing on the second day you enter the palace? It's just a crime. Come on, take Shen Li to the ancestral hall to punish him and kneel, let him reflect on it." A few guards immediately rushed in outside the door. They looked at Junhua and said indifferently, "Young Master Shen, please." Junhua would rather go to the ancestral hall than reason with this moody woman. He turned and walked out the door. Luju and Liuyan followed behind Junhua with worried expressions, wanting to say something, but they didn't say anything after all. Said that he was kneeling in the ancestral hall. But as soon as the guards left, Junhua immediately changed from kneeling to sitting. He sat on the futon, looked at the Luju and Liuyan, who always lowered his head, and said indifferently, "You two go find something to eat, I'm hungry." He hadn't eaten since yesterday, and now he only felt hungry and growling, especially after playing too much last night. So that he was now tired and wanted to fall asleep. Luju and Liuyan thought that they would be scolded by Junhua, and they originally hung their heads and waited for the scolding. But who knew that Junhua just asked them to find something to eat, and the two nodded happily and walked out of the ancestral hall one after another. Luju and Liuyan carried the food and hurriedly walked towards the ancestral hall, but were stopped by Shui Hu Del halfway. "What are you doing here?" Shui Hu Del was high-spirited, looking at the beautiful Luju and Liuyan in front of her, with a hint of jealousy in her eyes. "Back to my sister. Let's send some food to my young master." Liuyan lowered her head and replied with a humble attitude, "Do you understand the rules of the palace? Those who are punished for kneeling in the ancestral hall are not eligible to eat. But, my young master didn't eat yesterday, and if he doesn't eat today, I'm afraid." Before Liuyan finished speaking, Shui Hu Del slapped Liuyan's cute little face, and when she landed, a trace of blood flowed from the corner of Liuyan's mouth. And her face was also beaten to a wooden point, and she lost consciousness. "Bastard, do you want to change the rules of the palace?" Shui Hu Del scolded, so frightened that Liuyan lowered her head and didn't dare to reply. Luju raised her head and wanted to say something, but when she received Shui Hu Del's fierce gaze, she was so frightened that she immediately lowered her head and didn't dare to say anything. Seeing that the two of them were honest, Shui Dai nodded with satisfaction, and said to the maid behind her, "Take their food, and stare at the two of them by the way. If they dare to send food to young Master Shen, they will be fined 20 rods. "Yes." Several maids behind her stepped forward and took the tray in the hands of the second girl. Luju Liuyan watched the food being taken away. But there was nothing she could do, so she could only stand in place and be anxious. Junhua sat in the ancestral hall and couldn't wait for the food. And he was so hungry that his stomach cramped and secretly scolded Luju Liuyan for being a scourge, not to mention that he lost his body, and now he was hungry. Finally, hungry, tired, sleepy, and cold, Junhua fell asleep on the futon. He really just slept at first, but because the weather was too cold, and because he fell into the cold and biting dark river and froze before, his body was far worse than before, and today he fell asleep in the ancestral hall blown by the cold wind, causing him to get cold, and the temperature of his body gradually climbed. In his sleep, he felt that he was very uncomfortable, especially his head was dizzy and painful, so uncomfortable that it seemed to explode, so painful that he wanted to open his eyes, but he couldn't open them. And finally he fell asleep.